Hello, welcome to the Bio 122 video lectures for Chapter 40, the circulatory system. This is video 24. We're going to talk about specifically the mammalian circulatory system. And if we look at a human as an example of a mammal, um, we see that we can break the circulatory system into three major circuits. The first circuit is called the systemic circuit, which is the circuit that actually provides the oxygenated blood to the body itself, to all the somatic cells. Soma means body. Um, and so this is the general system that's delivering oxygen and nutrients to the brain, all the way down to your toes, to your fingers, um, through a series of arteries, capillaries, and veins. The pulmonary circuit is how we oxygenate the blood. So when the blood returns to the heart, the four-chambered heart of a mammal will deliver blood to the lungs so that carbon dioxide can be removed and oxygen can be inserted, can be picked up by the blood, and then return it to the left side of the heart so that it can be pumped into the systemic circulation. And so those two are what we make up what we referred to in the previous lecture about the double circulation system. But we can also talk about some other circuits too, and one of the prominent ones is the coronary circuit, which technically is just a subset of the systemic circuit. But the coronary circuit is how we actually provide oxygen to the heart itself. Even though blood is traveling through the center of the heart and being pumped, there is a very thick layer of epithelial cells, not to mention the cardiac muscle cells, that oxygen is unable to diffuse through that tissue. So the heart has to get its oxygen in the same way any other organ does, from the outside in through a series of arteries, capillaries, and veins. But the coronary circuit is the very first subcircuit of the systemic circulation, because immediately as the aorta leaves the left ventricle, and on the right side we kind of see the aorta coming off, there are 90-degree turns so that there is a artery coming off either side, the left main coronary artery, the right main coronary artery, that is then delivering the oxygenated blood to the heart itself. The reason it's called coronary, and I have a little picture of a king's crown there, a coronation means the event in which you crown a new king or queen. And so coronary just means a king's crown. And for anatomists that were looking at this layout of arteries on the surface of the heart, the little points that the arteries make is kind of like the little points on a king's crown, of course, kind of upside down, which is why I've angled this king's crown in that shape. But that's just why we call it that. Now, if we look at the double circulation system, we look at the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit, we can follow through this entire circuit. But being a closed circulatory system, we have to kind of decide on where to start. So let's just start at point number one, where oxygen-poor blood leaves the right ventricle, and it's going to go through the pulmonary artery up to the lungs, where it's going to remove carbon dioxide and add oxygen as it's in the lungs. And then in the step number three there, the oxygen-rich blood is now going to leave the lungs and travel to the heart via the pulmonary vein. And it's going to enter in the left atrium. Once it's in the left atrium, this oxygen-rich blood is going to travel to the left ventricle, which is the major pumping chamber, and it's going to then be delivered to the systemic circuit through the aorta. The aorta will split so that some of the blood goes up to the head area, other parts of the blood will go to the leg area, the trunk, and there will be sub branches of arteries going to every major organ and tissues until we eventually branch off into the smallest of the blood vessels, the capillaries, which is only one layer of squamous epithelial cells thick. So that's where all the diffusion of nutrients and gases will occur, both waste products and nutrients. And the capillary beds will then reform into blood vessels again. And as they reform, they join together with veins, and then the two major veins, the superior vena cava, which carries blood from the upper body, and the inferior vena cava, which is carrying blood from the lower body, will then re-enter the heart through the right atrium, and then the whole circuit starts again. Now, if we look at the definition of veins and arteries, this is something that is a very simple definition that people very often get very wrong, because it's very common for people to say that a vein carries deoxygenated blood and an artery carries oxygenated blood, and that has nothing to do with the definition. And if you think that's the definition, you are incorrect half the amount of time. So the difference between an artery and vein is only defined by the direction of the blood flow from the heart. It has nothing to do with the amount of oxygen that's in the blood. By definition, a vein will always carry blood towards the heart. So the vena cava is carrying deoxygenated blood from the body to the heart. Okay, so, well, if I were to just think that a vein carries deoxygenated blood, what's the problem with that? Because there's other veins that carry oxygenated blood. For example, the pulmonary vein. So let's go back to our previous picture. As the deoxygenated blood leaves the heart and goes up to the lungs, now we have the most oxygenated blood in the entire body, because this just came out of the lungs, and it's going to travel to the heart, to the left atrium. Because it's traveling to the heart, that's called the pulmonary vein. This vein is highly oxygenated. So you see, what's consistent in the definition is the veins are always carrying blood towards the heart. The vena cava vein is carrying deoxygenated blood, and the pulmonary vein is carrying oxygenated blood, but they're both going towards the heart, because that's the definition of a vein. So you see that you would be right on the vena cava, but you would be incorrect on the pulmonary vein as far as the amount of oxygen, if you misunderstand the definition of vein. Likewise, an artery is something that carries blood away from the heart. So the aorta, yes, carries highly oxygenated blood away from the heart into the systemic circuit, but the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood away from the heart and towards the lungs. So again, the definition of artery and vein has to do with direction, not oxygen content. So let's look at the other blood vessels, or all the blood vessels. And so as we look at an artery, because an artery is carrying blood away from the heart, this is where the highest pressure is going to be generated, because it's the heart, the pumping action of the heart, that generates the high blood pressure to literally push the blood through the system. For that reason, the artery has very thick walls compared to the vein, because the artery has to resist very high pressures, so has also a very thick layer of smooth muscle around it so that it can contract and change its diameter, but it has to be able to contract against a very large force of blood pressure. The vein, in contrast, has a very thin wall compared to the artery. It still has epithelial cells and a thin layer of smooth muscle, but it doesn't have to resist much blood pressure at all. In fact, the blood pressure is extremely low in a vein. So there's very significant structural differences between the two. And in between arteries and veins, remember, in a closed circulatory system, the blood cells themselves do not actually leave the circulation. So we branch into very thin walled blood vessels called the capillaries. And that's where all exchange of substances between the blood and the actual body itself, the interstitial fluid, actually will occur. The walls of the vein and the walls of the artery are way too thick to allow diffusion of anything across their walls. So only capillaries is where we're going to get movement of substances. So here's an example of a capillary with red blood cells in it. And one of the interesting characteristics of a capillary is that it's just barely big enough to allow red blood cells to move through single file. It's really just the perfect size. It's made up of squamous epithelial cells, simple squamous epithelial, just one layer. And so this allows for easy diffusion of gases and also small molecules like glucose and amino acids, the nutrients. And the delivery of the actual nutrients is based on the movement of water through these cells, based on blood pressure, and then the movement of waste products back in again is being carried on water, that now as blood pressure drops across the capillary, there's osmotic pressure being generated by proteins that are not able to pass through the epithelial cells, and so therefore generate a force moving water back into the blood at the end of the capillary. So diffusion is all that's happening here, just relying on pressures and osmotic pressures to move water back and forth with the dissolved nutrients and gases. Now, if we go back up to the heart, as blood is traveling through the circuits, the pulmonary circuits on the right side and the systemic circuits on the left side, it should be obvious that blood needs to travel in one direction through the circuit. But the pumping action of the blood would push blood both directions if we didn't have some sort of valve that would only allow the blood to move in one direction as it's being pumped. So we have that. We have two pairs of one-way valves. So two pairs means four valves altogether. So the first pair sit between the atrium and the ventricles, and they only allow blood to move from the atrium to the ventricle on either side. So these are called the atrioventricular valves. But they also have other names related to their particular structure. One of them has three leaves of tissue, and so it's called the tricuspid valve, and that's on the right side of the heart. And the other one is only got two layers of tissue, two little flaps of tissue, and it's called the bicuspid, but it has another name that's called the mitral valve. So these, you may have heard of people having mitral valve replacements or tricuspid valve replacements. And this is what we're talking about, because if those valves become damaged, they allow blood to move backwards through the heart, which makes the movement of blood inefficient. Likewise, between the ventricle and the arteries, so the pulmonary artery and the aorta, there's also valves that only allow blood to move from the ventricle to the artery and not backwards. And those are called the semi-lunar because they look like little half moons when you look at them in a microscope. So there's the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve in areas that you would expect based on their name. All right, so that's the end of this section on the general design of the mammalian circulation. Good day.